Okay, so today's lesson is going to be about production and growth. And so one of the central questions in economics is one of prosperity. So we ask questions like, why are some nations rich and other nations poor? Why do some nations that were rich become poor? And why do some nations that were poor become rich, right? And these are sort of the questions that Adam Smith was writing about in 1776 in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And they're the burning questions that, frankly, still interest us today. And the interesting thing, though, the way to think about this is sort of, why is there poverty amidst plenty? Right? That is sort of the question that we're sort of interested in talking about. Why is there such abject poverty among such sheer opulence? If you think about the opportunity sets of very wealthy individuals, they can afford to fly around the country and, as I think, who was it? I think it was Eddie Murphy several years ago, flew to Paris, France, to eat a filet mignon off the back of a supermodel, right? Why can he afford to do something like that where thousands, if not millions of people can't afford the medicine that they need to survive, right? They can't afford to have the food or the shelter or the clothing that they need, right? Why is there such poverty in the world amidst such opulence? Or to put it in more stark terms or more clear terms, one question that we could ask is, why is it the case that the number one killer in the United States is obesity and obesity-related complications, while so many people around the world quite literally starve to death, right? Basically, the U.S. has a problem where there are too many calories that are available at too low of a price, and so we die, right? While millions of other people have too few calories, which causes them to die. And if you think about that, it seems like a very simple solution. If there's too many calories over here and not enough calories over here, then just move some calories, right? We should just ship food to the places where people have too little food, and we would survive longer, and they would survive longer, and we'd all win. And yet somehow this problem, or this solution is impossible, evidently, because we don't solve it. And so what is causing this, right? What causes this to happen? And so the problem, right? The problem, and ironically, the solution is economic growth. Some countries have seen, explosions in their growth rates of their GDP, or more accurately, their GDP per capita. Other countries have seen shrinking or even just very slow growth, right? So if we look at, just two countries, let's look at the United States over the last 100 years, and we'll look at Bangladesh over the last 100 years. So for the U.S., we have averaged roughly 2% per year GDP growth, right? And Bangladesh, roughly 0.9% per year GDP growth, right? And so the U.S. is growing at a rate of 2% per year over the last 100 years. Bangladesh only grows at 0.9% over the last 100 years. And these numbers don't look all that high, right? 2% is a very low percentage, it seems. And it's certainly not much higher than 0.9. Like, true, it is more than double the Bangladeshi rate. But it's not that big of a difference, right? I mean, it's only 0.9 to 2%. It's not that big of a deal. But the miracle, or the reason why this difference is so big, And as a result, why the US standard of living is so much higher than that in Bangladesh is twofold. So, one, we started off wealthier than Bangladesh did. So, 100 years ago, the US was about 10 times wealthier than Bangladesh was. And the second part, but the more important thing, right, the second and more important reason is the miracle of compound interest. Or we'll just do compound interest. Right? And so it turns out that 1.1% of additional growth per year over 100 years compounds to a huge difference. And so if you're aware of the rule of 70, right? The rule of 70 basically states that you can take 70 and divide that by the growth rate. And that will tell you the years to double. All right, so if you take 70, divide by the growth rate, that will tell you how many years it takes for that asset or for that thing to essentially double from where it started. And so with the US, 70 divided by 2 is equal to 35, right? This means that GDP in the US doubles every 35 years, okay? But if we divide 70 by 0.9, we get something, I think it's 77.7, right? Which says that in Bangladesh, GDP doubles only every 77 years, right? So in 70 years, the US GDP will have doubled twice. It will have quadrupled. In Bangladesh, it won't even have doubled yet, right? And so this is sort of the stark reality of the world. When countries grow quickly, they can very quickly become exceedingly wealthy. When they grow very slowly, or if they even shrink, they grow very, very, very slowly, right? You can also apply this to your student loans, by the way. So you can take 70 and divide by the interest rate on your student loans, and that will tell you how long it will take for your student loan amount to double, which is why so most of you probably have somewhere around a 6 or 7% interest rate, which means that every 10 years your student loans double, right? And this is why everyone tells you you have to pay back your student loans quickly. It's like, well, yes, you do, because at 7% growth rate or 7% interest rate, your student loans are going to double very quickly, okay? So what we have here is a situation where we understand that compound interest leads to sort of fast growth if you have a interest rate or a growth rate that is higher than 1, basically. Okay. But what determines growth, right? What actually determines growth, or more accurately or more succinctly, what determines sort of that growth rate? Okay. And the simple thing is that productivity does, right? Productivity, it turns out, determines how quickly a country can grow, right? It determines their growth rate, okay? And as it turns out, workers in the U.S. are extremely productive with their time. And relative to the workers in the U.S., the workers in Bangladesh, quite simply, aren't. This doesn't mean that people in the US are somehow morally better than people in Bangladesh, or that people in Bangladesh are somehow less of people. It just means that in 1 hour, people in the US can produce more value than people in Bangladesh can in the same amount of time, right? And this isn't an indictment against the Bangladeshi. It's not saying that they're stupid or anything like that, or they're lazy or anything. It's not saying anything negative about them. Okay? It's literally just acknowledging that the U.S. On average is significantly more productive than Bangladesh is on average. Okay? So why is productivity so important? Right? Well, the more you can produce, the more you can ultimately consume. Right? So the more you produce, the more you can consume. So if we think about our very simple economy of Tom Hanks on the island in Castaway, right? Tom Hanks's character wasn't exactly the most productive person on the planet, right? And as a result, he went very hungry at times because all he could consume was what he produced, right? And that, if you think about it, that statement seems very intuitive and somewhat obvious, right? Basically, I'm saying that Tom Hanks can only eat the fish that he catches. And if he doesn't catch the fish, he can't eat the fish, right? And he can only eat the coconuts that he actually harvests. If he doesn't harvest the coconut, he can't eat the coconut, right? And so that's all this sentence means. The more you produce, the more you can consume. The more fish that Tom Hanks catches, the more fish that Tom Hanks can eat. So what determines productivity? And so there are 4 factors that determine productivity. And the first one is what we call physical capital. Okay, physical capital is essentially a measurement of the number of tools that a worker has at his or her disposal. And the idea is that more tools means more productivity. And if you don't believe me on that, imagine building a 100-story skyscraper with absolutely no tools whatsoever. Right? It would probably be not only very difficult, but damn near impossible to do. Right? Now imagine doing so with a crane and all the tools you could possibly want. Okay? In which world would it be easier for you to build me a 100-story skyscraper? Right? Obviously, in the world where you have all the tools you need. Okay? So tools help, and basic tools help, but specialized tools are even better. And so I've been telling the story about a lamp that I built recently. It was not my comparative advantage, so I should definitely never do this again. But it was fun, so maybe I will. But I build this lamp, and part of it involves, stripping some wire and hooking it up to the switch and the bulb and everything. And so, but I didn't have any wire strippers. And so what I was forced to do was either use my teeth, which aren't sharp enough to cut through, the rubber, I guess it is, a plastic casing. But what I did have were some cuticle scissors. And so I used the cuticle scissors to strip the wire, right? Now, it wasn't exactly easy. It probably took something like 10 to 15 minutes per wire to strip it, but it got the job done, right? And so if I'd had wire strippers, so my cuticle scissors were tools, right? They were a tool that I used. They were physical capital, but they weren't specialized tools for stripping wire. They were just generic tools. And so if I'd had the proper tools, I could have done the job much faster. Okay. The second factor is what we call human capital. Okay. And human capital, to an economist, is basically your knowledge or your skills. Okay. And the way you acquire this is through education, training, and experience. And so you're all, or at least most of you probably, are in college right now because presumably it increases your human capital, right? And so at some level, even just watching this video right now is ostensibly, right, an increase in your human capital. You're learning about economics right now. You're developing knowledge and or skills by watching this video, okay? And so human capital, people with more human capital or essentially more education are typically more productive, right? Not always, but typically. So think about, your dentist, right? How many teeth could you pull out of someone's mouth without killing them, right? But your dentist can do it, relatively easily, okay? So human capital is also tremendously valuable. The third factor is what we call natural resources. Okay, and so these are basically the things that nature has given you that you can use to produce things. So rivers, for example, are tremendously helpful because they lower the cost of shipping. Having several trees in the area can help you get building up a town or something, relatively quickly. Having fertile land is incredibly valuable because it makes it so that you can grow bigger and better crops. Having an oil field in town or in your community is helpful because you can pump the oil out of the ground and sell it. Okay. And so the natural resources that you have can actually help determine how productive you are, right? But it doesn't always. It's not a perfect correlation because if you think about it, Africa has more natural resources than almost any country or continent, rather, on the entire planet. And yet it's still incredibly poor. And so natural resources can help, but they are certainly not sufficient on their own to sort of increase productivity. Now, within this, we have two subcategories. We have renewable and non-renewable. Right? Renewable natural resources are natural resources that can be replenished relatively easily and quickly. So these would be things like forests, or fishing, or fish populations, deer populations. Let's see, rivers. You can dredge the river to, make it more viable for shipping, that kind of stuff. Non-renewable are things that sort of once you use it, it's kind of gone, right? And so the classic example of a non-renewable natural resource is, of course, oil, right? Once you've burned some oil, you can't exactly just plant, a new oil tree or whatever wherever you want, like you can with a tree. Okay, and so renewable resources, non-renewable. The distinction is obvious and intuitive at like a definitional level, but not quite as easy in the real world. It's sort of like the durable and non-durable goods from a couple lessons ago, but you should be aware of the difference between these two. And then the last factor is what we call technological knowledge. Whoops. Okay. And this is basically an understanding of how best to produce something. So 100 years ago, most Americans worked on farms because farms required a lot of labor to produce enough food to feed an entire country. Today, only a small fraction of the population works on farms because we know so much more about farming now than we did 100 years ago. Ford Motor Company and the assembly line is also a form of technological knowledge. And so technological knowledge is sort of knowing how to use people's physical capital, human capital, and the natural resources around you, right? So this is sort of the overarching idea of how best to deploy these sort of resources, okay? And so countries that have these four things tend to be wealthy. They tend to be wealthy. They tend to have low rates of child mortality, high rates of education and literacy, and all the things that we associate with living well and living healthily, right? Now, so now we need to think about, what can we do sort of as, not necessarily as policymakers, but perhaps as advisors to help other countries develop, okay? And so what can we do to promote growth, and what can we do to retard growth if we're not careful, okay? And so what we need to focus on, right, to promote growth, we need to focus on long-run growth, right? We need to focus on the long run. We need to make investments. Okay. And by making investments, we're essentially saying that we want our future to be better. Okay? But if you think about it, when we invest in the future, we have to forego consumption in the present. And so the cost of investments is the foregone present consumption. And so this is sort of why, let's say getting in shape, right? If you're trying to get back into shape or get into shape for the first time, it's incredibly difficult, right? And the reason why is because you have to sacrifice today for benefits that might be received sometime in the future. Okay? When you're in college, right, what you're doing is you're sacrificing whatever job you could have had in order to come to college. And so these are all forms of investment, right? You're focusing on your long run instead of your short run happiness. Okay?